Good morning, and today is the 12th day of Tevet, and the 5th of January. Yeah, it's the 5th of January. And we're learning the weekly Torah portion of Vayechi from the Rebbe's Sichos in Likutei Sichot, Volume 1. And we're holding by the very end of the introduction of the Sicha. This was just the introduction. It's one of the first times that Rebbe talked about Kabbalat Ol, about accepting the yoke of heaven, of doing things out of obligation and not out of understanding. So it's long-winded, the whole explanation. But now he starts the main part of the Sicha, really. And that's where we're going to start today. And we're going to do it quickly because I remembered now why you didn't remember that we had learned this, I think.
Because we didn't learn it.
Because we started from here. Because last year when we started, I read over the Sicha and I said the introduction is very long-winded. It comes to one point in the end that you have to have this action out of obligation, Kabbalat Ol, and not just do things because of your understanding.
Why can't it just be out of ahava?
So in a moment, that's what he says. That's exactly what he's going to say now. He's going to say, in his conclusion of the introduction, that the Kabbalat Ol means that when you're learning for yourself, and this is how he divides it up. When I'm learning for myself, that is Yirah. That is, it switches. That I do out of, meaning, when I'm trying to get closer to God, to cleave to God for myself, that I do because I understand the meaning of it, and it gives me a great amount of pleasure. So where do I exercise my obligation without receiving pleasure? We've talked about that. That I exercise when I do for others. It's especially important when I do for others. And that's his conclusion of why we learned all of this from Dan, from the tribe of Dan. Because what was their kindness? That they brought back, they picked up everything that people had lost. And it's not very gratifying, right? Because one of the mitzvot that is least gratifying in the world is the Shabbat Aveda. And when my kids were younger, it was very gratifying to them to find everything in the street and decide that they have to bring it back to someone. Why was it gratifying? Because they found it. It was great. The finding action is very good. That you love. But now go search for whose it is. And that becomes a real challenge and real toil and it's really difficult. And you have to watch over this thing until you find who it belongs to. It's a great act of really giving yourself over for your friend. And because you don't know whose it is. And you could have a lost and found in your home if you really take this seriously. Right?
2,000 chickens.
Oh, 2,000 shekels you probably don't have to give them.
2,000 chickens. 2,000
Oh,
chickens,
do that? Yeah.
One chicken.
It's like, that's the sort of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. Then he found a couple of chickens, and a couple of years later he gave him back a whole herd of goats. Because you have to take care of these things. Not everybody does that. In fact, for little children, what we say is ignore it. Like you don't know how to tell the difference between something that is valuable and something that's not. So the fact that the tribe of Dan did this is a tremendous kindness. You know, go find afterwards who this belonged to among 3 million people. So that says the Rebbe that you do out of obligation. That there's no pleasure in it. There's no gratification in these things. You might have a little bit at the end if you really do find who it belonged to and you give it back to them. But the process itself is very ungratifying. Whereas learning for the purpose of cleaving is very gratifying. Because you know you're working on yourself, you know you're doing something.
The Stapler had a big box on his Shabbos table full of pens. Every time somebody came and wrote him a petik or gave him an answer a bracha, he usually forgot the pen. And so he put it in a box, a Shabbos Alever, and it was sitting there waiting for Mashiach to come to tell him who the pens belong to. 1,000 pens belong to.
So today a pen would be lo shveh pruta. It's not even worth a pruta. It's not even worth a coin. So you don't have to keep it. But he did it because, in a certain sense, it was an obligation. Because he did out of the obligation, not because the person really wanted it or needed it. Or maybe they would have said, where I wrote for the stipler, I mean, in the 40s and 30s in Bnei Brak, even then a pen was already worthless. So, but still, I wrote a kvittel to the stipler, so it's an important pen now, something like that. In any case, so now what he does is he takes this whole topic of Kabbalato, of Kabbalah Soul, and he's now going to explain it the way we did last year, according to Hachna'av Dalam Taka. According to the Ba'al Shem Tov, those 3 stages of spiritual change. The first, and we're not going to read it inside, we're going to read it very quickly because it's also a little long. It's 6 pages here.
We have tomorrow as well.
Well, I don't know if even if we don't read it, I'm not sure we'll finish. Okay, so the first part is here in chapter 8. So we just explained the conclusion, which was in chapter 7. That you have to have both obligatory action when it comes to your fellow, and you can use the act of feeling gratification and understanding and pleasure when it comes to advancing yourself in your service of God. That you can. That also has issues in and of itself, but here he doesn't get into them here. Let's just read it once in Hebrew, just so that you see it. ההוראה מן האמור ביחס לעבודת השם היא, in chapter 7, גם זה שלומד תורה ומקיים מצוות במידה הנעלית ביותר, עד כדי כך שהוא עמד בקירוב מקום למשכן ולארון, הרי אם נתכוונו לטובתו הוא, וחסרה לו ההתמסרות לעשייה טובה ליהודי אחר, כיוון שפגום בו העניין של ואהבת לרעך כמוך, יסוד כל התורה, עלול הוא לאבד את מה שבנפשו. So it says, even if you're the closest to the tabernacle, like the tribe of Levi, or the encampment of Yehuda, even though you might be the closest, if you don't have this obligatory status, this obligatory feeling in yourself, that you have to sacrifice yourself for your fellow, we're on page 93, that you have to sacrifice your needs and everything else for your fellow Jew, so you might lose even the part that has pleasure in serving God. You need both sides. So I said that this is like the ahava and yira. And it's interesting that they flip. Because when it comes to ahavat Yisrael, when it comes to loving your fellow, there you need yira, there you need obligation. When it comes to fearing God, which is what all the inner service that a person does is in order to come to fearing God. Or at least it starts from there. So that, or say it another way, I misspoke. I want to come to cleaving to God, which is love of God. But in order to come to that, I have to be very close to the tabernacle, which is a state of fear. So they flip both of them. But in any case, that's the complete picture. Now that we have this idea of what obligation is and what it requires, now he's going to explain obligation in 3 different Kabbalah Soul, in 3 different stages. The first stage is the tribe of Dan. The second stage that we'll see is the tribe of, the first stage is not Dan, is it? Sorry, the first stage is Naphtali. No, I'm sorry, it is Dan. I don't know why I suddenly doubted myself. The first stage is Dan. The second stage is Asher. And Asher will also be our explanation of the third stage. Okay? So let's see. And the stages are submission, separation, and sweetening. Submission says, and this is chapter 8 now. המעלה אליהם מגיעים על ידי עבודת קבלתו למסירות נפש לאהבת ישראל כלולה בהרשת ברכה. Now, בברכת, now I understand why, because it is Naphtali. I made a mistake. The general idea of Kabbalah Soul is Dan. And now he's going to divide it between Naphtali and Asher. Naphtali is going to have the first stage, which is the submission. And Asher is going to show us the second 2 stages, separation and sweetening. They also go together, separation and sweetening, so it fits that he studies it, that he learns it from the same tribe, from Asher. Why? Because one of the things where did the Ba'al Shem Tov learn this whole 3-stage process from? He learned it from the word chashmal. which is maybe the most secret word in the Torah, which today in modern Hebrew means electricity, but means ratzov vashov, which means running and returning. But it also literally means that it's a composite word that means chash mal. Chash means to be quiet, to be silent, and mal means to speak. And the Ba'al Shem Tov, following the Ari, he says there are actually 3 stages here. The Ari says you divide it into 4 stages. Chash, mal, mal. There's 2 parts of silence and 2 parts of speech. The Ba'al Shem Tov makes the 2 parts of, well, not the 2 parts, the middle 2, the chash mal in the middle, he makes that into separation. So he has a chash, and he calls it mal, mal. So the middle stage, separation, and the last stage, sweetening, are both the same word, mal. Because mal has 2 meanings, there's more than 2 meanings, but here it means 2 meanings. Mal means to circumcise, that's the separation, and mal also means to speak. Because the original context in which the Ba'al Shem Tov taught this was to his disciples, and he taught them, how do you say Torah without feeling yourself? How do you come to a state in which the Torah that you're speaking is as close to prophecy as possible? We don't have prophecy now, but we have the ability to reach a state in which it's not our ego that's talking. We're not talking for our own sake. We don't feel ourselves when we're talking. We're saying the idea in its purity. Now this is very different than what some other groups call speaking in tongues or speaking automatically or all this nonsense. Because that is like flow of you say whatever you want. It's not like that here. In Torah you prepare, you have to understand what in the world you're talking about. If you didn't spend time in the study hall understanding the concept and bringing up questions about it, until it's perfectly clear in your head, you understand it perfectly, you cannot begin to speak about it. But when you come to speak about it, what are you left with? Oh, I understand this. So it's like I want to show off, I want to tell you how much I know. The Ba'al Shem Tov says that the way to influence people to follow God, to become closer to God, is not by making them follow you. You can't be anyone in the equation. You have to erase yourself, you have to subtract yourself from the equation. It has to be that they hear God, not you. Because it's the Torah that you want to give over, not yourself. So the chash mal mal was originally taught in the context of him telling his disciples, how do you come to a state in which the Torah that you've spent years learning and you understand fully, you can now give over to people in a way that they don't feel it's you who's talking. They feel it's Hashem who's talking. So you're not talking gibberish, you're talking about the deepest concepts that you have worked through for years. It took you years to understand it. But you don't want to be the one, you don't want to be a memutza mafsik. You don't want to be someone in the middle that they come to you and say, oh, you're so great. That you don't, you have to subtract yourself out. So the whole process of submission, separation, sweetening is how to speak sweet words, how to speak in such a way that it's not you. That the person feels it's not you. This is what Hashem wants. That's the most important thing, because I don't bring people to me, I bring people to God. Okay? So that's chash mal mal, that's submission, separation, sweetening. So submission he's going to learn from Naphtali. What does it say by Naphtali? So we'll do this quickly. Hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to finish the 2 others, separation and sweetening. It says by his bracha, not here, but rather Moses' bracha, Moses' blessing to the Shevet of Naphtali. He says to them, Yam v'darom yirisha. He will inherit the west and the south. Page 93, right column on the bottom. המילים ים ודרום ירשה מבטאות 3 דרגות בכיוון של מלמטה למעלה. So the fact that he has the west, the south, he will inherit, these are 3 levels, he says, 3 stages. How? The west represents the Shekhinah, we know, right? The west is where the Shekhinah is. Okay? So he is the Shekhinah, the divine presence. Darom, as we know, is where there is great revelation of godliness, which is above the Shekhinah. Why is it above the Shekhinah? Because it's wisdom. The Shekhinah is only a revelation of godliness within the human affairs. But the south, where the sun is strong, it represents the revelation of godliness that is even above human affairs. And not only that, it's Haya Hove V'yeh Ke'echad, the end of the third paragraph. Hana'aleh mibchinat zman u'makom. It's above time. Haya Hove Yeh equals Chesed. And Haya Hove Yihiyeh. Three together equals 72. Chesed, loving kindness in this sense, is going above. It's going to the source of time, the source of space. Right? Where do we see that? That when God started creating the world, right, the act of creation itself is already teva tov. It's already to give. It's already revelation of something that's above creation. I want to give. So for that reason, He creates time and He creates space. Yeresha, finally, He will inherit. That is even a higher level. In any case, that inheritance comes by itself. You can't make it happen. So this in and of itself is already an encapsulation. This is what we call itkalelut, inter-inclusion. But within the first stage of submission, we have a submission, separation, sweetening. The submission is the Shekhinah. In order to find Shekhinah between two people, to find the divine presence between two people, they have to submit. What does it mean they have to submit? They can't argue. They have to accept each other. The separation is always, even though it sounds like that it's in the same way that when the sun shines, it pushes away the darkness. The great revelation of God pushes away everything else. So there's nothing you can see. So we have this saying, in the midday, can you see a candle? You can't see a candle burning in the midday because the sun's too strong. That is what separation is about, intensifying our experience of the divine. That's really what separation is about. And when that happens, everything that's not divine falls apart, or everything that's at least concealing the divine, not that it's not divine, but it's concealing it falls away to the side. And finally, the inheritance, it comes by itself. You can't cause sweetening. You can't sweeten something just by wanting it to be sweet. It has to actually be sweet. It's a process. Once you do submission and separation, there comes a moment when something is sweetened. To say it another way, this Rebbe, who's now learning by the Ba'al Shem Tov, and he's going to be speaking to his followers, he can't speak whenever he wants. It's not like he decides, today I'm going to speak. Why? Because it depends on whether he's done submission and separation. If he's done submission and separation, then he could be in a state where it's practical for him to come and speak now, because he knows that the people will not be drawn to me, they will be drawn to God. So the sweetening is always an issue, because people want to jump to the sweetening. Everybody wants to say sweet words. Everybody wants to express themselves. They want their words to be heard. But that's exactly the opposite of sweetening. Sweetening is when it's not my words that are heard, but the words that are heard are God's, not mine. So sweetening you can't really do yourself. It has to happen by itself. So he says inheritance is the same way. It's not like when you go to buy something in the store. When you go buy something in the store, you decided that you want to buy it. But when you get an inheritance, it has nothing to do with you. You didn't kill your parents, God forbid, right? It was their time, and that's how it came to you.
You can meet an old lady and you can persuade her that you want to get her Yerusha.
Yeah,
like your friend in California.
That doesn't my friend. My friend and your friend and everyone's friend. In any case, what do we learn from this? So he says this whole process is really a process of coming to Kabbalah Torah. Kabbalah soul, as much as the tribe of Dan told us that it's just a state, now he tells us it's a process. What's the process? How do you come to this process? That you first of all have to have submission. What's your submission? And he said, if there's another Jew, again, the whole point is that this is your relationship, your avas Yisrael, your love of your fellow, that is obligatory. You don't do it just because you want to. You do it because you have to. So he says the first thing is you can't argue with them. There has to be a state of submission towards others. I accept you. The second thing is that there has to be a state of separation. What's the state of separation? That the reason that we love each other is because of God, not because of me. It has to be like the sun in its intensity. That what stands between us is not just the divine presence, but it's above time. The connection that we have is above time, like our connection. We think we're finished here. After our 120 years, what's going to happen? We'll be sitting in Shamayim, and you're going to be looking at the clock and saying, "Why is he not here?" And what kind of excuse am I going to have in Shamayim?
They don't have clocks in Shemini.
So
I have to know.
And finally, then you can come to the fact that it appears by itself. That's why you don't feel that it's yours. Because what you're able to work with someone, what you're able to do with someone, like you convince someone to put tefillin on, in the end you say it's not me. And he also says it's not him because he's not doing it for you. He may say you care about him.
Every time you go out on a visit to fill into the army, it's as clear as daylight that it's the Rebbe doing it. You just know it. You don't even have to.
So that's the Ba'al Shem Tov. And tomorrow, God willing, we'll do Asher, who does the separation and the sweetening of Ba'al Shem Tov.
The 72 is the 72 parts of the Rebbe.